next speaker is His Excellency Ambassador David Komisyong. Allow me to introduce him. David Komisyong was born in the Caribbean island of St. Vincent, the son of a traveling Methodist minister of religion. David received his primary education at Tranquility Primary School in Trinidad before attending Harrison College and the University of the West Indies in Barbados. He won a Barbados exhibition in 1979 and the Sir Fred Phillips Academic Prize at the Faculty of Law, University of the West Indies in 1981 and has been a practicing attorney at law since 1984. David Komisyong is a former senator in the government of Barbados and is currently Barbados ambassador to the Caribbean community known as CARICOM and to the Association of Caribbean States. He is also a founder member of the Caribbean Pan-African Network, the Clermont Payon Movement of Barbados, the Caribbean chapter of the International Network in Defense of Humanity, and the Global African Congress, and was an architect and the first director of the Barbados Government's Commission for Pan-African Affairs. He represented the Caribbean region at the seventh Pan-African Congress in Uganda, played a key role in the United Nations World Conference Against Racism in South Africa, and has represented the diaspora on the African Union's Economic, Social, and Cultural Council, ECOSOC. Since the year 2012, Mr. Komisyong has served as a member of Barbados National Task Force on Reparations. He is also the author of The Wide Streets of Tomorrow, Essays and Speeches, and then it is The Healing of the Nation, The Case of Reparation, and the third one, The Pan-African Love Story of Arnold and Mignon Ford. Ambassador David Komisyong, over to you.
Thank you, Sister Mallet, for that very comprehensive introduction. It's a pleasure to be here to participate in this discussion. Let me begin by giving the audience a little insight into CARICOM, the Caribbean community. We are a grouping of 15 nations in the Caribbean, and most of the nations being in the Eastern and Southern Caribbean. And as a grouping, we have a relationship with Cuba, which is a Northern Caribbean nation, some 90 miles away from the United States of America. Many persons would know that Cuba has been under embargo, sanctions from the United States of America ever since the year 1960. In fact, October of this year will be 62 years of the US embargo against Cuba. And when we say US embargo, we are talking about a regime of unilateral sanctions, otherwise known as unilateral coercive measures. And why is Cuba subjected to such sanctions? Well, from way back in the 19th century, the United States, or important elements within the United States, wanted to appropriate Cuba, wanted to either colonize Cuba or to make Cuba a part of the American territory. So much so that when Cuba fought for its independence from Spain, from the Spanish Empire, in the late 19th century, the United States entered the conflict in 1898, assisted in the defeat of the Spanish Empire, and then proceeded to impose a protectorate, a virtual protectorate over independent Cuba. So Cuba, having gained its independence from Spain, became a virtual colony or protectorate of the United States until 1959, 1st of January 1959, when Fidel Castro and his fellow revolutionaries completed the successful Cuban Revolution against an American puppet government. And revolutionary Cuba began as a nation on the 1st of January 1959? Well, as the new revolutionary government of Cuba insisted on an independent policy in relation to the United States, President Eisenhower commenced the imposition of sanctions against Cuba in October of 1960. Ever since then, the sanctions have been continually deepened. 1960, the US prohibited exports to Cuba. By 1961, they ended diplomatic relations with Cuba. By 1962, they put an embargo upon all trade between the US and Cuba. By 1963, they prohibited travel to Cuba. They also outlawed financial transactions with Cuba and prohibited the purchase or importation of any merchandise of Cuban origin. By 1982, they unconscionably placed Cuba on a list of countries that sponsor state terrorism. And by 1992, they prohibited even foreign-based subsidiaries of US companies from trading with Cuba. They put restrictions on remittances to Cuba, and they authorized sanctions against even foreign companies that invested in property that Cuba had, American property that Cuba had nationalized way back in the early 1960s. Now, the countries of CARICOM, most of us were former colonies of Britain. We began to gain our independence in the 1960s, the mid-1960s. And by 1972, we had 4 independent CARICOM countries, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Guyana, and Barbados. And by 1972, the United States had orchestrated almost the total isolation of Cuba within our hemisphere. Cuba had been thrown out of the Organization of American States, and the United States of America insisted that virtually all of the countries of the hemisphere should isolate Cuba. Well, the 4 relatively small Caribbean community nations determined that we were going to defy the United States of America, and we were going to extend diplomatic, economic, and political recognition to Cuba. And we did so on the 8th of December of 1972. And ever since 1972, the countries of CARICOM have given solidarity to Cuba and have had a campaign to combat the American embargo against Cuba. And the first point I want to make about unilateral economic sanctions is that first of all, unilateral economic sanctions are an act of economic warfare. Secondly, unilateral economic sanctions are contrary to international law. So they are unlawful unless they are being used in response to an attack on the country imposing the sanctions. In other words, a country under international law, a country is only entitled to impose unilateral coercive measures, that is, to engage in an act of economic warfare if it is acting in self-defense, if the country on which it is imposing the sanctions has attacked it. And we can go to the United Nations Charter to get a good understanding of this. If we go to Article 2 of the UN Charter, it tells us that the organization is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all of its member states. All member states are equal. Let me emphasize this. And so I do not understand this concept of the United States being the international community. I wish someone would explain that to me. Why isn't Africa the international community? We must not accept any notion that a handful of Western nations constitute the international community. So let's disabuse our minds of that. The UN Charter makes it very clear that it is issues, first of all, it makes it clear that where countries have any dispute, that those disputes are to be addressed through negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement. In other words, there is to be peaceful settlement of disputes. The Charter also goes on to make it clear that where there are matters that require some form of imposition of force, that those matters are reserved to the United Nations Security Council. So, for example, Article 41 of the Charter tells us that the Security Council may decide what measures not involving the use of armed force are to be employed to give effect to its decisions. That is, its decisions pertaining to disputes, international disputes, or international breaches of the peace. And it may call upon the members of the United Nations to apply such measures. These may include complete or partial interruption of economic relations, in other words, economic sanctions, and of rail, sea, air, postal, telegraphic, radio, and other means of communications. So it is absolutely clear that if sanctions are to be imposed, they are to be imposed not unilaterally, they are to be imposed through a decision of the UN Security Council. Article 51 of the UN Charter tells us that nothing in the present Charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations. So in other words, yes, if you have been attacked, you could respond with sanctions. You could respond with unilateral sanctions. But outside of that, it is really, sanctions are really the province of the UN Security Council. So we would have to ask the question, has Cuba attacked the United States of America, thereby justifying the United States of America imposing unilateral sanctions on Cuba? The answer is no. Has Ethiopia attacked the United States of America, thereby justifying the United States of America imposing sanctions on Ethiopia? Once again, the answer is no. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have to be very clear about this. We have to insist that the imposition of unilateral sanctions are the province of the United Nations Security Council. If the matter of Ethiopia goes before the UN Security Council, and the UN Security Council, all 15 members, in its wisdom, determines that sanctions should be imposed on Ethiopia, then so be it. That would be in keeping with the UN Charter and with the principles of international law. However, if that is not the case, it is not lawful for any country, the United States of America or any other country that Ethiopia has not attacked, to simply impose unilateral sanctions on Ethiopia or on Cuba for that matter. Now, ever since the year 1992, Cuba has taken an annual resolution to the United Nations General Assembly denouncing the US embargo, the US sanctions against Cuba as being unlawful and demanding their removal. And every year since 1992, that resolution has been passed by the members of the United Nations General Assembly. In fact, over the years, there's been growing support for that resolution, so much so that now, typically when it comes up for the vote, the only countries that vote against it tend to be the United States, Israel, and maybe at most one or two other very close US allies. But the General Assembly has said consistently since 1992 that those unilateral sanctions are unlawful and have directed the United States to terminate them. Of course, the United States has not bowed to the collective will of the UN General Assembly. They have ignored the collective will of the real international community. If you want to find the international community, you find it in the UN General Assembly. United States has ignored that. But the point is, the Caribbean community, the 15 states of the Caribbean community, we see Cuba as part of our Caribbean civilization, and therefore we defend Cuba, and we have unanimity in opposing the US sanctions against Cuba, a member of our Caribbean civilization. Africa and the African Union has to think about this matter of Ethiopia in a similar way. Ethiopia is a founding member of the Organization of African Union. It is a founding member of the African Union. Addis Ababa is the headquarters of the African Union. One would expect and imagine that if there is a breach of international law in relation to a member, such an important member of the African Union, that there would be African solidarity and unanimity in dealing with this matter, in opposing the unlawful imposition of sanctions on Ethiopia. The other point to be made is this: sanctions are not about solving any conflict. A country does not impose unilateral sanctions in order to solve a conflict. A country typically imposes unilateral sanctions in order to effect regime change, to bring down a government, or to make a government, a regime, bend to the will of the country that is imposing the sanctions. Sanctions are not about solving any domestic dispute or conflict. So I won't go on. I won't go on much longer. I would just like to say that there's clearly a Cold War dimension to the situation with Ethiopia. There are big countries, big powers in this world who seem to believe that they must dominate, that there's no room for big power coexistence. So in other words, either the world must be dominated by the United States or by China or by Russia, and that there's no room for peaceful coexistence. Well, we the African and Caribbean and non-aligned countries, we must disavow that. We must say that there's no place in this world for any Cold War. We will not accommodate ourselves to any Cold War notion that either you're in the US camp, or you're in the Chinese camp, or you're in the Russian camp, or the NATO camp. That is the way towards instability and destruction in our world. We must therefore stand for true non-alignment, and we must insist no more Cold Wars. There's room for all of us in this world, and we must coexist peacefully in this world. We must adhere to the principles of international law. We must adhere to the principles of the United Nations Charter, and we must build a genuine multilateral system. My final point is that if we are to resist these big powers, we cannot do it if we are divided. We have to be unified. Just as CARICOM tries to be unified on the issue of Cuba, the African Union needs to be unified on the issue of Ethiopia. But in addition, we must try to build African, Caribbean, and even wider third world unity. Last year, September, we had a very historic first Africa CARICOM summit, where heads of government of Africa and the Caribbean came together, and we made a decision at that summit to establish a permanent forum of African and Caribbean territories and states. We need to follow through on that decision. We need to consolidate that permanent forum, because that permanent forum could then become a location in which the governments and the statesmen of Africa and the Caribbean come together to discuss difficult political issues, like the situation in Ethiopia, for example, like the issue, the situation, like this matter of the imposition or the threatened imposition of sanctions against Ethiopia, like in the Caribbean, the situation of Haiti. We have a very difficult crisis situation to deal with. That permanent forum would allow us to come together, to be able to share ideas, to discuss these problems, and then to have solidarity, to support each other in helping to deal with these very difficult political matters. So that is my hope, that we will establish that permanent forum between the African Union and CARICOM, between Africa and the Caribbean, and that we will, as you know, as a collective body, be much stronger and much more united in dealing with these kinds of very difficult issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador David, for that. Really, yes, if we want to go further or stand stronger for Africans to unite, is the only way. Not only for Africans, also, as you say, for all the south part of the world, and also for the third world, as it's called. So it's a controversial name. Yes, so our next speaker is Brother Dr. Biniam Misgun. He's Dr. Biniam Misgun. He's from Eritrea, currently based in South Africa. He is a lecturer at School of Social Science, University of KwaZulu-Natal. His area of expertise is economic history and development studies. Brother Biniam, over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. I had a very exciting moment listening to esteemed colleagues and ambassadors. Really appreciated that. What I wanted to speak about for today is the socio-economic and human cost of sanction, drawing a bit of experience from Eritrea. First, a brief background on the sanction that has been imposed on Eritrea, just so you know how it came about and what it did to Eritrea and how Eritrea tried to combat it as well as mitigate against its consequences. It came at the back of souring relationship between the US and Eritrea in the mid 2000s. And Eritrea's independent policies were not going down very well with the US. And so the US State Department were issuing a lot of combative statements warning Eritrea, and eventually they rallied around African states and brought about the UN Security Council resolution in December 2009. And of course, African states that participated in it were apparently twisted by the US, but the US was the owner of this particular resolution. And then, of course, it was also again empowered in 2011 once again to strengthen it, apparently. And this was in relation to Eritrea's involvement, apparent Eritrea's involvement in Somalia's conflict. We all know now this was just a cooked story. Even the Somalia-Eritrea Monitoring Group, year after year, came out with a report indicating that there is no evidence to suggest that Eritrea is supporting Al-Shabaab. Despite this fact, this sanction had continued. Now, those sanctions supposedly were trying to twist Eritrea into behaving, as they call it. Yeah, this spoiler must be put into its place. That's how this sanction was framed and phrased. And of course, it was supposedly military and doesn't have much economic impact to it. However, we all know those sanctions are very broad and interpreted differently by those who participate in it. Yeah? So this has been there for close to 9 years, and it was formally lifted in 2018. Once again, when Ethiopia and Eritrea forged that peace agreement, and Ethiopia rolled that later to the UN Security Council. It's on the back of that the sanction was lifted formally. Yet they continue to exist in different ways and in different interpretations. And of course, they call it a technicality, has not been addressed to get the sanction completely lifted off the back of Eritrea. Now, what are the consequences of those sanctions? You can look at them in different ways, but I would like you to think about the economic aspect to it, the social political aspect to it is very important. The economic aspect, obviously, investors are often wary of sanctioned states. They wouldn't want to come to those states, yeah? So that's one way of impacting it. So, create a general narrative about it that would push away potential investors. And in addition to that, there's high cost to working with sanctioned states. So Eritrea, had been trying to attract investors in the mining and culture sector. They are, staying away from the country simply not because Eritrea doesn't offer a decent investment opportunity, but rather because there's a huge cost attached to it. Through going formal process of the bureaucratic process, being able to import in the necessary supplies that are considered to be having a dual purpose. All that is impacting negatively on the business environment, and that's also high cost for anybody wanting to invest in the country. And already existing businesses are also being impacted negatively by it. Yeah? You can't get loans from outside. Importing goods are becoming very much problematic because they have to go through this multiple regulation, multiple checks, and the cost becomes a lot higher. Yeah? And the companies generally tend to avoid doing business with the country, or businesses in the country for that matter, few risking their relation with the major partners and the major powers. Yeah, if you look at most mining companies that were operating in Eritrea started being Western-owned companies, but later on they handed over to the Chinese because the cost of doing business in Eritrea started to become costly to them, politically costly, not financially, not rewarding, but politically costly. So they started passing it over to Chinese companies who didn't have much problem with that kind of arrangement. Yeah. Compounded, it has caused a massive economic strain. And of course, the economic strain would eventually be felt by ordinary citizens, and opportunities that would be created for them has been hard to come by and that much difficult for the state to put in place. And obviously, it has also a debilitating effect on states' ability to provide services. And particularly if you consider those products that were supposed to be imported in order to provide agricultural extension, energy, and other services and necessary infrastructures. Had been severely impacted, yeah, telecommunication, because they tend to have a dual purpose, yeah, civil and military, and that was the excuse given to deny Eritrea or make it harder for Eritrea to be able to import those goods. And it goes into a pharmaceutical company that operates in Eritrea that were trying to get input for the company. It has been very difficult as well. So those things have a compounding effect. And eventually, the ordinary citizens tend to feel it. Weaker service delivery, drugs not being available efficiently, their living standard not being lifted up, general misery. And this is the human cost. And eventually they tend to look outside of the country, for better opportunities. And that has been the case, whether it's in Eritrea, Cuba, or Zimbabwe. People tend to feel the need to go elsewhere in order to meet their aspirations. And of course, the state won't be able to provide the necessary opportunities for those individuals to meet their aspirations. So it's very important, to understand those things. And then, of course, the other element is sanctions obviously create entrenched, positions. They're not going to address any problem, but they create entrenched positions. And that also, the political atmosphere becomes a little bit difficult one, tensions, and of course the sanctions were meant effectively to crush the state in order to bring about regime change, as it's been indicated by Ambassador David, and everybody knows that. And of course, those businesses do not want to come to those places, or those who are willing to work are afraid of working with those states because they know what those sanctions entail and what the purpose of those sanctions are. So it has a compounded effect both on social, economic, as well as political realities on the ground for ordinary citizens. And obviously, Eritrea tried to combat this by mobilizing, at one hand, by mobilizing citizens, both inside and outside, somehow reminding them that this is time to fight back. Of course, a strong diaspora mobilization, the Eritrean government has been able to achieve, which is astounding. And they had been outside the UN headquarters and Geneva on a yearly basis for the last 10 years, fighting against those sanctions. And of course, it has also sought to engage its neighbors, and that's very important. Solidarity with the neighbors. Sanctions only work when other parties and other states are participating in it, in the same way that the Western governments were interpreting the UN sanction to mean that Eritrea should not have access to any kind of income, whether it's through remittance or the 2% tax, solidarity tax that Eritreans were contributing. So Canada, Sweden, all the other countries were trying to prevent Eritreans from contributing to the well-being of their countries. And this kind of solidarity is very important in withstanding the sanction itself, but then now they're coming to prevent Eritreans from contributing to well-being of their country, and that's also something that we need to pay attention to. So when sanction is there, then there are different interpretations that have been taken out of it in order to create a difficult atmosphere for all of us. And the third element that Eritrea has sought to mobilize or be part is, forging solidarity with like-minded states and like-minded groups. And here you have the group friends and defense of the UN Charter. Most of them have been sanctioned by the United States, a unilateral sanction. And of course, Eritrea has also been unilaterally sanctioned by the US on several occasions, and it's not new for Eritrea. But we have to somehow find a way to fight back those things. And of course, fighting back for them not to happen, but also fight back when they happen, a way to mitigate against them. Mobilizing citizens would be a very important way of addressing that as well. I think I will leave it here. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Binyam, for that. Really, we are here, of course, mainly today also to show or demonstrate that our challenges are shared. And so in order to solve, then we need to have that collective voice. So thank you very much, really, to bring in the experience of Eritrea.